There is a country sitting on more oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than Iran, more proven reserves than any nation on earth. And yet, its refineries are silent, its production crippled, its economy shattered. Here's what nobody tells you. In the modern world, resources alone no longer create power. Systems do, and when systems collapse, even infinite oil stays trapped underground. Here's why this matters. Venezuela's failure is not just a national tragedy. It is a blueprint for how wealth can become a prison, how sanctions amplify decay, and how oil can stop being leverage when the machinery behind it breaks. This is where the pattern begins. Venezuela's oil story starts not with poverty, but with abundance so extreme it reshaped the nation's identity. In the 1920s, massive oil discoveries transformed a rural country into a global energy supplier almost overnight. By the 1950s, Venezuela was the world's largest oil exporter. Caracas gleamed with modern infrastructure. The bolivar was one of Latin America's strongest currencies. Oil promised permanence, stability, sovereignty. At first, it looked like a miracle. Then the bill arrived. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry, creating PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, S.A. The move was celebrated as economic independence. Oil revenues flooded the state, social programs expanded, political power centralized. Not diversification, dependence. The nation tied its future to a single commodity, assuming demand would rise forever and management would remain competent indefinitely. This is where the pattern hardens. When a state replaces institutions with revenue, oil becomes a substitute for governance. For decades, the system appeared to work. Through the 1980s and 1990s, PDVSA was considered one of the most professional national oil companies in the world. Venezuelan engineers were globally respected. Production remained high. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Political pressure crept into management decisions. Investment slowed. Maintenance budgets tightened. The danger wasn't what they saw. It was what they ignored. Oil fields decline without constant reinvestment, especially when the crude is heavy, complex, and expensive to extract. The real turning point came in the late 1990s. Hugo Chavez rose to power on a wave of popular discontent, promising to reclaim oil wealth for the people. His government restructured PDVSA, replacing technocrats with loyalists and redirecting revenues toward social spending. Production targets became political tools. Expertise became optional, not efficiency. Control. Oil income surged during the 2000s commodity boom, masking structural decay. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. By 2002, the tension exploded. A massive strike paralyzed PDVSA. Chavez responded by firing more than 18,000 skilled workers, engineers, geologists, managers, the institutional memory of Venezuela's oil industry. Here's what nobody tells you. Oil production is not just drilling. It is chemistry, logistics, reservoir management, safety systems, and constant maintenance. Lose the people, and the oil stays underground. Production never recovered to its previous peak. Still, high oil prices kept the illusion alive. From 2004 to 2012, crude traded above historical averages. Revenues flowed. Imports soared. Venezuela stopped investing in refineries, pipelines, and equipment, relying instead on foreign suppliers and partners. Debt piled up. Inflation crept higher, and the economy hollowed out beneath the surface. At first, it looked like prosperity. Then the bill arrived. By 2014, global oil prices collapsed. Venezuela's vulnerability was exposed instantly. Without savings, diversification, or operational resilience, the state faced fiscal freefall. Shortages emerged. Currency controls distorted markets. Hyperinflation loomed. Production declined year after year, not because oil was gone, but because the system to extract it had rotted. This is where the trap snaps shut. When oil revenue replaces institutions, losing revenue destroys institutions further. Then came sanctions. Starting in 2017 and intensifying through 2019, U.S. and allied sanctions targeted Venezuela's financial system, oil exports, and access to global markets. Some economists argue sanctions were not the initial cause of collapse, but an accelerant. pouring fuel on an already burning structure. And here's the mechanism. Modern oil production requires constant access to spare parts, financing, insurance, shipping, and technical services. Sanctions sever these arteries. Even when oil exists, it cannot move. Venezuela's crude is among the heaviest in the world. It requires specialized equipment, imported diluents, and advanced refining. When sanctions cut off access to these inputs, production fell off a cliff. From more than 2.5 million barrels per day in the early 2000s, output dropped below 500,000 by 2020. Not depletion, paralysis. Here's why this matters beyond Venezuela. The case reveals a brutal modern truth. Sanctions do not need to destroy oil reserves to neutralize them. They only need to break the systems that convert oil into usable power. Tankers without insurance don't sail. Oil without buyers doesn't generate revenue. Wells without maintenance don't produce. And engineers without pay leave. The psychological damage compounded the technical collapse. Skilled workers fled the country. Capital vanished. Infrastructure rusted. Refineries caught fire or shut down entirely. Even when sanctions were partially eased in certain scenarios, restarting production proved far harder than expected. Oil fields are not light switches. They degrade when neglected. Restarting them requires years, not months. The irony is devastating. Venezuela sits atop the world's largest oil reserves yet imports fuel. Gas stations sit empty. Power grids fail. Not because the oil is gone, but because the system to harness it no longer functions. This is the deeper pattern at work. In the 20th century, oil wealth created power almost automatically. In the 21st century, oil without systems creates dependency, vulnerability, and collapse. Let me show you exactly how this inversion works. When institutions weaken, oil revenue fills the gap. When oil revenue collapses, institutions disappear entirely. Sanctions accelerate the final stage by isolating the system from recovery inputs. And now we arrive at the question that defines the second half of this story. If Venezuela proves that having the world's largest oil reserves means nothing without functioning systems, what does that reveal about sanctions, power, and the future of resource-rich states in a globalized economy? Because what looks like failure on the surface is actually something far more instructive. What Venezuela reveals is not just the collapse of a single nation, but the exposure of a new global mechanism, one that turns abundance into paralysis. Here's what nobody tells you. In the modern financial system, oil is only powerful if it can move through networks of credit, technology, insurance, and trust. Break those networks, and oil stops being leverage. It becomes weight. This is where the pattern begins to fully reveal itself, not as a story of ideology or misfortune, but as a systemic trap engineered by global interdependence. To understand how sanctions work in this context, you have to look beyond headlines and into infrastructure. Oil production today is not a self-contained activity. It depends on foreign drilling equipment, chemical additives, software systems, maintenance contracts, shipping insurers, international buyers, and dollar-denominated finance. Analysts suggest that when sanctions sever access to even a few of these inputs, production degrades rapidly. Not because wells run dry, but because the system around them fails. Here's the mechanism. Sanctions target finance first. Banks refuse transactions. Letters of credit vanish. Without financing, PDVSA cannot pay suppliers. Without suppliers, spare parts never arrive. Pumps fail. Pipelines corrode. Refineries shut down one by one. Even when oil is extracted, tankers hesitate to load it. Insurance companies withdraw coverage. Ports deny access. Buyers demand deep discounts or disappear entirely. Oil exists, but it cannot travel. And oil that cannot travel cannot generate power. At first, it looks like a temporary setback. Then the bill arrives. Some economists argue that sanctions alone do not destroy economies. They expose structural weakness already present. Venezuela demonstrates this brutally. By the time sanctions intensified, the industry had already lost much of its technical core. Production had been declining for years. Capital expenditure had collapsed. Skilled workers had fled. Sanctions did not cause this decay, but they locked it in. This is where the trap closes. Once isolation reaches a certain threshold, recovery becomes exponentially harder, and the damage compounds over time. Heavy, crude fields require constant pressure management. Shut them down improperly, and reservoirs suffer permanent damage. Refineries left idle deteriorate faster than they can be repaired. Pipelines, once corroded, must be replaced entirely. Analysts suggest that every year of underinvestment adds multiple years to any potential recovery timeline. The danger wasn't what they saw. It was what they ignored, the irreversible nature of neglect. Meanwhile, the population absorbs the shock. Inflation explodes. Currency collapses. Imports vanish. Fuel shortages spread despite oil abundance. Electricity grids falter. Hospitals struggle. And the social contract erodes. Sanctions, in this sense, operate less like a hammer and more like a vice, slowly tightening around an already weakened structure. Here's why this matters globally. Venezuela is not unique in its resources. Many nations sit atop valuable commodities. What makes Venezuela unique is that it demonstrates how easily those commodities can be neutralized in a world governed by interconnected systems. In earlier eras, resource-rich states could bypass isolation through smuggling, bilateral deals, or military force. Today, global logistics and finance are centralized, digitized, and regulated. If you are cut off from those arteries, scale becomes irrelevant. Some scenarios indicate that even if sanctions were lifted entirely, Venezuela's recovery would be limited by lost human capital and decayed infrastructure. Engineers do not return overnight. Capital does not rush back into politically unstable environments. Trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild. And oil fields do not forgive neglect, not resilience. Entropy. Other scenarios suggest partial recovery through selective sanctions relief, foreign partnerships, or shadow trade networks. But even these paths impose constraints. Discounted sales reduce revenue. Barter arrangements limit flexibility. Technological dependence deepens. The nation trades sovereignty for survival. This is the paradox. Sanctions weaken the state, but they also lock it into asymmetric dependence on whoever is willing to engage under restrictions. Let me show you exactly how this reshapes power. Sanctions do not need to force political change to succeed. Their real effectiveness lies in denial of scale, denial of modernization, denial of recovery. Over time, the sanctioned state becomes irrelevant in global markets, not because it lacks resources, but because it cannot convert them into influence. And this lesson extends far beyond Venezuela. Russia, Iran, and other resource-rich nations have studied this outcome closely. They invest in alternative payment systems, domestic technology, parallel shipping networks, and political alliances designed to bypass sanctions. Some succeed partially. Others struggle. But the race is on, not for more oil, but for more system resilience. The world is no longer divided between producers and consumers. It is divided between those plugged into global systems and those locked out. This is where the psychological shift occurs. Oil once guaranteed relevance. Today, it can guarantee vulnerability. Nations rich in resources but poor in institutions become targets, not powers. Their wealth becomes static, unable to move, unable to defend itself. Here's the trap. Resource dependence without system control invites external leverage, and yet sanctions are not cost-free for those who impose them. Global supply tightens. Prices rise elsewhere. Markets adapt. New trade routes form. Over time, sanctions may accelerate fragmentation of the global system itself. Some economists argue that widespread use of sanctions encourages parallel economies, reducing long-term effectiveness. Others contend that the dominance of Western financial infrastructure still gives sanctions unmatched reach. Both may be true. But Venezuela's case delivers a stark conclusion. In a world where extraction depends on integration, isolation turns even the largest reserves into stranded assets, not because the oil disappears, but because the world moves on without it. This is why the phrase "sanctions work" requires context. They do not work by fixing nations. They work by freezing them, by halting motion, by converting potential into stasis. Venezuela's oil is not gone. It is simply inaccessible, trapped beneath layers of technical decay, financial exclusion, and institutional collapse. And the final lesson cuts deeper than geopolitics. Here's what nobody tells you. The future of power belongs not to those with the most resources, but to those who control the systems that turn resources into action. Pipelines, payment rails, insurance markets, engineering talent, legal credibility. Without these, even the richest nation becomes poor. Venezuela shows the endpoint of ignoring this truth. A country rich beyond measure, unable to fuel its own economy. A state with the world's largest oil reserves reduced to watching them decay underground. Not because oil failed, because systems did.